Waterloo has always been seen as a tactical victory for the Duke of Wellington. His small but highly trained Allied army outfighting the veteran soldiers of Napoleon's Grande Armée. But was there more to Napoleon's defeat than the tactics and fighting prowess of the Allies? By 3 o'clock, the ground had begun to dry out, and the disadvantages the French artillery had suffered in the morning were reduced. But just when it seemed the French were about to regain the advantage, Napoleon himself caused the battle to take a fateful turn. Crucially, at some time between 2 and 3 o'clock, Napoleon left the battlefield. Exactly why he did this at such a critical stage is still a mystery.
There is clearly something not right with Napoleon this day. He's complaining constantly about the pains in his stomach. He's easily exhausted. This is a man in middle age who's beginning to suffer all the ailments of the middle-aged and is very conscious of it all the time.
Whatever Napoleon's condition, he was absent from the battlefield for nearly 2 hours, returning to his headquarters at Rossomme, nearly 2 miles away. He left control of the embattled French army in the hands of his second-in-command, Marshal Ney.
Ney was a superb soldier at the tactical level. If you wanted a charismatic leader to draw his sword and say to his men, "Follow me for glory," Ney was your man.
But Napoleon could hardly have chosen a worse moment to hand over command.
At about 3 o'clock, Ney looks up there onto the ridge, onto the right-hand side of the Anglo-Dutch position, and he thinks he sees the Allies retreating.
No one's absolutely certain what happened, but the best historical theory is that Wellington was adjusting some of his battalions, as he did during the course of the battle, moving some out of the firing line, moving them back to a reverse slope position. And it seems clear that Ney saw this movement taking place and thought, right, they finally cracked, they're beginning to move exactly as we always thought they were going to, and then orders an unsupported cavalry charge.
Ney thought the critical moment had come, that the French artillery had finally broken the Allied line. Whether he was unsighted by battlefield smoke or by his own sheer impetuosity, Ney seized his chance and acted.
He turns to the nearest cavalry brigade commander and he says, "Take your brigade, capture the plateau." And the cavalry brigade commander says, "No fear, Gov," or whatever the French equivalent is. Ney loses his temper, very typical of Ney, grabs Miho, who's the cavalry corps commander, and says, "Miho, take your cavalry, capture the plateau, go now."
Not only does he commit that brigade of cavalry, he commits the entire cavalry corps. So within the space of the next 30 to 40 minutes, thousands of French horsemen are committed to the battle on an area where, frankly, there is insufficient room for 2 regiments to charge. And suddenly you have 8 regiments, 12 regiments, 16 regiments.
Ney himself personally takes post ahead of them, waves his sword in the air, and the whole of the cavalry moves off down the hill and up towards Wellington's Ridge.
It was an amazing spectacle, one of the biggest cavalry attacks of the Napoleonic Wars. 5,000 sabres knee to knee, climbing the slope to put the Allies to flight. But the Allies had not broken. As the waves of French cavalry crested the ridge, they found Wellington's infantry in position on the reverse slope, formed in impregnable squares. The Allied artillery was waiting for them. The French cavalry attacked again and again, but it was impossible for them to break through the disciplined squares. Ney had made a catastrophic error of judgment.
Napoleon comes back from Rossomme, takes a look and says, "What on earth are we doing?" He then starts to organise some artillery and some infantry to put up in support of the cavalry, but it's too late, and the flower of the French cavalry is blown away.
Hundreds of cavalrymen and horses were killed or wounded, and the exhausted survivors played little further part in the battle. It was a disaster for Napoleon. With Prussian troops now closing in, the French were forced to fight on two fronts. Napoleon had lost the advantage. But the truth is, just as he was not the commander he once was, his army was not the fighting machine it once had been. Mike Robinson is intrigued by Ney's erratic behavior at Waterloo. He suspects the legendary marshal, known as the bravest of the brave, may have played a crucial part in Napoleon's defeat in the battle.
Ney always led from the front. He was in the thick of it, he was in the smoke, he was in the musketry. He was a man who was so wholly involved in the battle itself that he lost sight of what was going on around him. And his passion was roused to such an extent that he lost his own self-control. He made lots of quite serious mistakes of a tactical nature throughout the day.
A veteran of more than 70 battles, Ney had always been one of Napoleon's most dependable commanders. Having joined in the ranks as a humble trooper, he was promoted general before he was 30 and made a Marshal of France by Napoleon when he was 35. But after the horrors of the Russian campaign of 1812, Ney became steadily more unpredictable.
It's difficult to tell after this lapse of time just how much that affected his later performance. Certainly he was prone to make more mistakes, both on a strategic and a tactical level. He was prone to greater outbursts of fury or passion or temper, and he was slower to calm down. And certainly his performance on the day isn't what you would expect from the man who you want to lead your army to victory.
By 6:30 in the evening, the Battle of Waterloo is approaching its final bloody climax. As Prussian troops fight their way towards the Allies, Napoleon is more and more dependent on his second-in-command, Marshal Ney. But after the disastrous cavalry charges of the afternoon, Ney is becoming increasingly reckless. Can modern psychology shed light on Ney's behavior? To test his theory, Mike assembles a panel of leading military psychiatrists, experts in identifying symptoms of combat fatigue in modern service personnel.
The picture that we have of Ney in the closing stages of the Battle of Waterloo is a man on the lower slopes of the Allied ridge. He's lost his hat, he's had 5 horses shot from underneath him. He's striking the barrel of a cannon with the flat of his sabre. I can't see that as normal behaviour in someone exercising that rank and those responsibilities.
The picture you've just described is a man who's just lost it completely, who is just lashing out, who's out of control, which is in stark contrast to what he should be, even as a lieutenant or a colonel. You know, he's supposed to be in command, most of all of himself.
But could Ney's crucial loss of self-control during the battle have been due to a psychological complaint, similar to what is now recognized as combat stress? Not everyone agrees.
In terms of latter-day thinking, from the First War onwards, battle shock, combat stress, shell shock, really it's a functional diagnosis. In other words, can they function? He functions.
But he didn't function as a leader.
Yes, he did.
In the sense of overall command, he functioned as a leader, a very junior leader, but not as a senior leader.
No, he functioned as he'd always functioned. He would always be at the front. He was the last man to step out of Russia. I don't think this is behaviour that's incongruent with him.
We have to be careful not to get into a situation where we see the diagnosis as an incapability element, that that these are people who are incapable of doing things. But what's happening is he's not thinking straight. Now that's okay. If you're a private soldier, that doesn't particularly matter. If you're a general, that's a big problem.
But having discussed the evidence, do the group believe that Marshal Ney was psychologically armed?
I think he was fit. I don't think it's a psychiatrist's job to say otherwise. He was one of these men that was used, a man for all seasons. The good guys do all the hard work and do burn out. And of course Napoleon, perhaps we should question whether Napoleon was fit to serve at that time. But of course Ney, if he failed, he'd have a great scapegoat.
My feeling is that during the course of the battle, for a brief period, he experienced, I would use the term combat exhaustion. He developed tunnel vision and he reverted to type as a very junior soldier rather than functioned as a leader. In that sense, he was suffering a temporary psychological disorder that we would probably now call battle shock.
The discussion casts important new light on the part Ney would play in the last act of the battle. Around 7:30 in the evening, Waterloo reaches its final dramatic climax. After marching all day to the sound of the guns, Prussian troops have now linked up with the Allies. Time is running out for Napoleon, and his only chance is to commit the last precious reserve.
All he has left now is the Imperial Guard. The Guard have never been beaten. They're the cream of the French army, and provided they're properly used, they still just might pull victory from the jaws of defeat.
He's only going to commit the Imperial Guard at the absolute crisis of the battle. Because if he loses them, he loses the Empire. And so when the decision is made to commit the Guard, this is the crucial moment. There's no going back from this. You've got to win.
The final moments would reflect the problems Napoleon had faced throughout the whole battle. His artillery had failed against Allied troops protected by the reverse slope and soft ground. What troops he had left after years of attrition had been wasted in rash, uncoordinated attacks. Now the Imperial Guard, his last reserve, would have to attack over deceptively tough terrain selected by a master of defensive warfare. Struggling up the difficult, muddy slope, they would have faced point-blank artillery fire, round shot and canister. Finally, command of this critical last attack was handed to a man likely suffering from battle shock, Marshal Ney. Napoleon could only look on helplessly as Ney, yelling and screaming, led the column into the dense smoke which cloaked the Allied ridge.
Noise, you can't see anything, you're trying to pick your way across obstacles, force your way through the mud. This is a pretty unpleasant movement they have to do. But they are the Guard. And despite the discharges of canister, despite the chaos, despite the difficulty, they keep going.
As the exhausted French guardsmen reached the crest of the Allied ridge, it seemed for a moment that they had broken through. But suddenly the red wall of Wellington's infantry rose from the reverse slope. From less than 30 yards, the Allied muskets couldn't miss. More than 500 guardsmen fell to the first volley alone. But no soldiers, not even the Imperial Guard, could withstand such murderous firepower. For the first and only time in their history, Napoleon's Imperial Guard broke and fled.
And once the Guards start to retreat down the hill, the whole French army breaks and the whole French army starts to withdraw. And that effectively is the end of the Battle of Waterloo.
With the end of the Imperial Guard, Napoleon's empire passed into legend and a new Europe was born, paid for in the blood of nearly 50,000 French, Allied and Prussian soldiers on the muddy, steep slopes of the Waterloo Ridge.